So I hope you have thought about how you could measure this process of influence from institutions to individuals in the digital community. Now I will give you a solution for this case that I have used in my PhD. So let's discuss the operationalization of institutional theory. This is just an example for you to understand how you can do things with your theory as well. So let's go first for this definition of institutions. We are drawing up on Richard Scott, a work that he has done in 2001. So in this book, that you can find the reference in the slides, Richard says, institutions are social structures that have attained a high degree of resilience, which are composed of cultural, cognitive, normative, and regulative elements that together with associated activities and resource provide stability and meaning to social life. Very abstract definition, isn't it? Naturally, as you read the whole book and you understand what he's saying, it becomes less abstract. But at the first glance, you read that, okay, but what do you mean by that? Okay, so the first thing that you say is that, okay, for being institutions, I need to understand that this is an established social structure. It's a way of repeating the same behavior again and again and again. And I also can understand that this is going to happen because you have elements in this way of agency. And when I am behaving online or not, but in our example online, all these elements that are cultural, cognitive, they are normative, they are regulative, they are going to influence the way I perceive reality, and they are going to provide me a guidance about what should I do, okay, in a particular context. And you can think about yourself, for instance, when you say you are a good father or mother, okay, or what do we mean by being a good father or mother? Okay, it's because society has an understanding about what are the values, what are the behaviors, how you measure the things. And we use the idea of institutions every day in our lives. It's just that they are so taken for granted that we don't realize that most part of our behavior is institutionalized, is informed by these elements that, in the day-to-day, they appear transparent. We don't focus on them, but they are there for us to influence our behavior. Another two authors, Berger and Luckman, they have also discussed the idea of institutional and theory and institutionalization. And they have said, well, the process of institutionalization, they are very useful for us to understand what are the mechanisms of influencing the behavior of people. Because we're saying, okay, people behave in a particular way because of the institutions, but how this process happens. So Berger and Luckman have discussed that, and they say, well, in the beginning, there is no such a behavior. The behavior doesn't exist. So, for instance, you can think once upon a time, long time ago, that society didn't have marriage. For instance, marriage was invented, but before there was no marriage. But then a group of people come together and they establish, in order for society to work better, we need to have this institution, the marriage, in which we regulate the form of relationship between two people or sometimes even more people. Okay, so it depends on the culture, it depends on the period of time. So then this has been created. So for Bergman and Luckman, they say the process of institutionalization always starts with a group defining a new sort of behavior. And they establish that this behavior is good for society and it's going to be supported by other elements in society. For instance, a norm or a rule. So, for instance, in a country, you may have some rules defining how a marriage is acceptable or not in that particular society. Once this behavior is accepted by this social group, people start repeating the behavior. And then we start having an expectation that that behavior is going to happen. And finally, after this behavior is repeated for a long period of time and repeatedly through socialization, people start perceiving this behavior as the right thing to do. So if you go back to many societies and you ask people, how do you manage the relationship between these two people that want to live together and constitute a family together, most people are going to say, well, they marry. That's the marriage, isn't it? So then you say they take for granted that the way of having that social structure depends on this institution that in our example here is about the marriage. So now that you have understood the idea of an institution, we go back to Scott in 2001, Richard Scott, and he says, well, when you think about institutions in a broad way, and you're talking about this process of institutionalization, it may be difficult for you to operationalize, to define the constructs that are making that influence and to measure the influence. So what he has done, he has consolidated the literature on institutional theory and has proposed a framework, a conceptual framework for operationalizing research on institutions. And has said, well, if we are researching institutions, we need to understand the rules, norms, power systems, identities, standards, scripts, protocols. I see, and even artifacts in his framework. Is that artifacts are not so important for us. I've left this a little bit outside. But even artifacts influence the way we behave. Now we have elements that's more easy for us to investigate. We can find rules. We can find norms. We can define protocols and scripts. Before we could not, because it was not in front of us, these elements. Now we can. So let's think about how I have operationalized my research using the theory to inform first my research question. So the first thing it was about having a research question that is connected with this theory. So my research question would be, do governmental institutions influence the behavior of people in digital communities? So I keep here the idea of governmental institutions, I keep the idea of digital communities, and I say that there is an influence. I'm not sure, but I want to investigate. Now, how do I operationalize that? Now I'm going to ask questions to people covering the mechanisms of influence. And these mechanisms are rules, norms, power systems, protocols, and etc. So I don't go there and ask people, hey, tell me if the government influenced your behavior. Perhaps they cannot see that because it's too broad. But instead of this, I try to investigate, do norms influence your behavior? From where these norms come from? Do rules influence your behavior? From where these rules come from? And so on. And then gradually, I'm going to collect my data. So when I start doing my investigation, let's suppose that I focus on the rules, the legislation. Indeed, my research was very broad, but let's think about only rules now. So if I focus on rules, what I'm saying? I'm saying that the legislation, the regulations, they influence the way people behave. So now I define that the government has created the rules that somehow are going to